In 1995, a 28-year-old Russian businessman paid 100 millions for a piece of the Soviet Union's collapsing oil industry. 10 years later, he sold it back to the Russian government for $13 billion. Along the way, he bought a football club to launder his reputation in the West, and years later, in a London courtroom, his own former partner's lawyers proved in open court that the deal that made him rich was, in the judge's own words, easy to rig, and was in fact rigged. This is the story of Roman Abramovich, and how the collapse of an empire built modern football's most powerful oligarch. To understand how a 28-year-old with no real business background ended up controlling a piece of Russia's oil industry, you have to understand what Russia looked like in the early 1990s. The Soviet Union had just collapsed. The state owned almost everything: oil fields, factories, entire industries, and suddenly none of it had a clear owner anymore. Boris Yeltsin's government needed cash, and more urgently, it needed Yeltsin to win re-election in 1996 against a resurgent Communist Party. The solution was a program that would later be called loans for shares. In exchange for loans to keep the government running, a small circle of politically connected businessmen were handed shares in the country's most valuable state assets: oil companies, mining giants, television networks, for a tiny fraction of what they were actually worth. It was, functionally, the largest transfer of public wealth into private hands in modern history, dressed up as a temporary financial arrangement. Roman Abramovich did not have the political connections to get a seat at that table on his own. What he had was Boris Berezovsky, a mathematician turned media mogul who had Yeltsin's ear and needed money to fund his own television empire. Abramovich made Berezovsky an offer: financial backing, in exchange for Berezovsky's influence in creating a new, state-owned oil company called Sibneft, and making sure Abramovich and Berezovsky ended up owning the controlling stake. The plan worked exactly as designed. Sibneft was valued at roughly $600 million. Abramovich and Berezovsky acquired their controlling interest for around $100 million, a sixth of what the company was actually worth, through an auction process that, on paper, looked like any other privatization sale. For the next decade, Abramovich ran Sibneft and quietly became one of the richest men on earth. By the time Vladimir Putin's government moved to bring strategic industries like oil back under state control, Abramovich was ready to sell. In 2005, the state-owned energy giant Gazprom purchased Sibneft for more than $13 billion. Abramovich personally walked away with somewhere around $10 billion from the sale, on top of billions more he'd already collected in dividends over the preceding years. An initial investment of $100 million had turned into one of the largest single paydays in the history of modern capitalism, and Abramovich needed somewhere to put both the money and the scrutiny that came with it. In 2003, 2 years before the Sibneft sale even closed, Abramovich bought Chelsea Football Club, then a mid-table London team in real financial difficulty. On the surface, it looked like a rich man's hobby. In practice, it was one of the most effective reputation-laundering purchases in modern history. Overnight, a Russian oligarch few people outside of Moscow had heard of became a fixture of English football. A generous, popular owner who spent lavishly, won trophies, and was photographed courtside next to Premier League royalty. Owning Chelsea didn't just buy Abramovich a football club, it bought him access, credibility, and a permanent, glamorous alibi, a reason for the Western world to see him as a sportsman and a benefactor, rather than a man who had personally profited from the largest wealth transfer in Russian history. The partnership that made Abramovich rich eventually turned on itself. In 2011, Boris Berezovsky, by then exiled in London and estranged from the Kremlin, sued Abramovich for £5 billion, claiming he'd been intimidated into selling his own stakes in Sibneft and another company for a fraction of their true value. The trial became a spectacle. Berezovsky accused his former partner of betraying him after everything he'd done to make Abramovich's fortune possible in the first place. Abramovich's lawyers countered that there had never been a formal partnership at all, just a business relationship between two men who understood how things worked in 1990s Russia. Abramovich won the case in 2012, But buried inside the trial was an admission that outlasted the verdict. Under questioning, it was acknowledged in open court that the original Sibneft auction process, the one that had made both men billionaires, was, in the exact words used at trial, easy to rig and was in fact rigged. For nearly 2 decades, Chelsea Football Club shielded Abramovich from the consequences of how his fortune began. Then, in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. Within weeks, the British government sanctioned Abramovich directly, citing his closeness to the Kremlin. He was stripped of his role at Chelsea. Under the threat of the club's assets being fully frozen, Abramovich announced he would sell, and in May 2022, the club was sold for roughly £2.5 billion. That money never reached him. The entire sale proceeds were frozen in a UK bank account, with the government insisting the funds be directed toward humanitarian relief for the war Abramovich's home country had started. As of late 2025, more than 3 years later, that £2.5 billion is still sitting frozen, with the British government now warning Abramovich that if he doesn't agree to release it for Ukraine voluntarily, they will take him to court to force it. Roman Abramovich didn't build a fortune. He was handed one, in the chaos of a collapsing empire, by a system explicitly designed to make a handful of insiders rich before anyone could stop it. Buying Chelsea was never really about football. It was the exit strategy, a way to convert a fortune built on a rigged auction into something that looked, to the entire world, like legitimate success. It took a war to finally catch up with him. And even now, the last $2.5 billion of that story is still frozen in a bank account, waiting to see who it actually belongs to.